I'm ready. Whenever you guys want to start. Okay, do it.
Hey, everybody, welcome. Hello, and welcome to the first of the spring lecture series. Really glad to see everybody in person. And I think the really good news is read the papers. It looks like our masks are going to come off pretty soon. The screen more than usual to talk to you and exactly what. Slowly getting back to normal. Can't wait for that. And this is normal too, to have a real lecture and to have Stephanie here too. What's good to have her join us. Lots of things going on. But you guys may have some sense of that, but this new president is so dynamic, looking for us in so many ways to be actively engaged in where we want to go. So stay tuned, there'll be more on that coming up. I think it's going to be a really wild and fun time. Thanks, everybody. Glad you're here. Greg, you'll be in a nutshell.
Where you go to the mic. Okay, so this is the first of a series that we thought that you probably are curious about what your faculty does when they're not teaching and their work and their research interests. So Stephanie's leading this off. So let me just read from her bio here. So Stephanie is the co-director of Office CA, experimental collaborative practice with her partner Gallo Canizares. Is that good?
Yeah.
My Latin tongue. And then she's, our newest assistant professor here at the Michael Graves College School of Public Architecture. Her research focuses on how interfaces can destabilize architecture to produce constantly evolving structures. With an emphasis on movable and indeterminate architecture, her work creates new fictions and new realities through subtle and overt manipulations of existing building components. Lately, she has been focused on food, its colonial legacy to the urban landscape, and the cultural value of food images. She's currently pursuing a master's, to that end, a Master of Art in Gastronomy at Boston University, which is very interesting. She received her MR from Ohio State University, where she was a graduate enrichment fellow and a recipient of the Architectural Research Travel Award. She got her Bachelor of Arts in Architectural Studies from Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, where she was a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar. She's taught, before coming here, she's taught at Ohio State, CCAD, Texas Tech, Virginia Tech, University of Houston, and was the 2020 visiting teaching fellow at the School of Architecture at Taliesin, which is where I met Stephanie the first time. And no, she does not play the keyboard. That's here for the next event they set up. So anyway, but maybe she does, I don't know. Anyway, welcome, Stephanie.
Take this off. Yeah. Oh. Can you guys hear? Can you guys hear as well virtually? Just double checking before we get started. Perfect. All right. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Hello.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to talk about my work today. One thing I think you're going to realize is that I do a lot of different things because my research interests are very varied. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they act standalone. But I really try to pursue all of my interests because sometimes I feel like it's important to kind of constantly be questioning what I'm working on. So before we get started, I wanted to kind of set up the framework where my practice really kind of focuses our work. So really for us, we consider representation a spectrum that goes from realism to abstract. It's not just a communicative tool. It's not just an act of making a drawing or making a plan or section, but instead the spectrum really starts to it really starts to focus how we think about our concepts and how we think about our design process. So for example, we view realism as being as something we associate to being true to life, an abstraction which seeks to break it down, and then we see the literal living right in between. And for us, the literal is an alternative that replicates our daily life. Sorry, it's still very close. Our daily lives, it's full of inaccuracies, awkwardness, absurdities, and potential misreadings and narratives. The literal is not quite realistic or quite abstract. It could be considered banal. It is what it is. It's every day. In popular culture, literally has been used very much in a colloquial misuse, which I personally really enjoy. If it's good enough for Parks and Rec Chris Traeger to misuse, but also Louisa May Alcott, Jane Austen, and Mark Twain to use, I think there's something really powerful about misusing the word literally. It might anger your English teachers, but I'm all for it. When we consider both words literal and literally in both their dictionary definitions and colloquial use, we can find a new territory. One where we replicate the everyday world, but also reimagine its potential future narratives by asking speculative questions. The beauty of the word literal is that it can either mean figuratively or actually. It embodies a paradox, one that asks for specific translations and the other for vagueness. With this in mind, our work seeks a balance between sincerity and irony. And we tackle the literal in three main ways within our projects. And these lenses really influence how we look at the project throughout design concept, process, and then what we consider kind of a post-occupancy, though we've never really designed and built structure. So our imagined post-occupancies of projects or the process of it. The first is reenactments, events that have or could have happened. We approach the historical through the recreation of historical events. We use the word reenactment instead of recreation because we like to capture the movement and momentum as though we are drawing up performance. And I think similarly as like in bad docuseries or documentaries where you get these reenactments of perhaps like a crime or something, there's something kind of awkward, absurd about the recreation of it that it's not fully true. There's a certain basis of the truth and a certain basis of what happened, but there's creative licensing. So for this is an example, one of our reenactments and one of our processes for a type of material that we make, which I'll go a little bit later. The second are scenarios, events that could happen. We focus on creating scenarios from the predictable to the unpredictable, but as much as we can kind of guess the unpredictable. We use scenarios as an operational tool to embed our projects with narrative. The use of scenarios let us emphasize our focus on user interaction and user agency. These renderings were made through the design process to kind of think about how we were thinking about this installation at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and how we wanted people to interact. So scenarios are really critical in the way that we use in our design process. And the last kind of category or lens that we really look our work through is simulations, events that will happen. We regard simulations as technical projections of how things will unfold in a given situation. We work with animation software and game engines to explore how real-world physics might change our perception of materials or give users more agency. Our simulations are primarily software-based, but also have a strong narrative component. Similarly, we create the simulation for one of the installations where I'm actually going to talk right about now. It's kind of a way to engage the user and viewers in the audience with what could be done within the installation. I've broken this lecture down into kind of three main research categories, which is soft materials, building without water, and then my interest in food. So the first is soft materials. When we think about interfaces, we think about its relationship to new digital technologies, or when we think about interface design, you're probably thinking about the app on your phone. For me, I view the built environment as an interface. The way that we open a door, the way that we shut a window, or the way we turn on the lights. The way that our body interacts within the built environment is an interface. And with this in mind, the way that I design with soft materials is to emphasize this idea, is to emphasize the nature of user agency and interaction within it. So for most of my work, the duality is contrasted by hard and soft materials, allowing for a more fluid and what is considered more feminine architectural elements to be on equal footing with with the stoic and stable building materials we consider to be like stone or rock. Softness allows for user agency through a more intimate relationship with the user. It can be moved, piled, scrunched, it could be displaced, it could be played with. The following few projects showcase my research into soft materials. The first is noodle soup. So in 2018, we were lucky enough to win the Ragdoll Ring competition. And it was to design an outdoor stage at Ragdoll. Ragdoll is an artist residency that is located in Lake Forest, Illinois. So it's about an hour north of Chicago. And the artist residency has a yearly competition for a temporary architecture installation, but during the year, it's the home for writers, poets, dancers, anybody who needs kind of a retreat. Noodle Soup, our winning entry, explore the potential of the architecture scale interfaces. It features a set of fuzzy fixed structures, which we called walls, not very creative, around which soft linear pliable pieces of furniture, which we called noodles, that's a little better in the name. The soft elements can interact with the hard structures to serve functional purposes, such as seating, but they can also act as oversized toys, freely configurable in a variety of ways. The walls are conceived as though being peeled up from the ground on one side and sculpted seating on the other. The contrast between natural and artificial is further articulated by having the concave side clad in green. So as you can see, sometimes it blends in with the beautiful nature. So right after this, there's like a prairie that's part of the National Park Reserve. So it is incredibly beautiful and natural site. And then the convex side is clad in a neon shade of yellow to reinforce the artificial qualities of the project. As the viewer makes their way around the competition, some walls recede into the greenery of the landscape, while others emerge to the foreground as geometric objects in a picturesque forest. This installation is pretty much just traditional wood framing. The walls and stage are the only fixed elements, and then the noodles are basically giant bean bags about 30 feet long. But those actually took a while to figure out the perfect dimensions because we wanted to make sure that it was light enough that one adult could carry it or two children, but it couldn't be too heavy. It couldn't be too light that the wind will blow it away. So there was a mixture of, not necessarily the most scientific way, but it was a mixture of different pellets on the inside to kind of get the perfect weight. And one thing about this project is that we had no idea how it was going to be used. When you sign up for the competition, you propose a project, they just say there's going to be a variety of things that happen, and you're like, okay. So the stage sometimes was used for more traditional elements, like at the bottom left, you see a band playing and people watching the band, but they also had stilt walkers and puppeteers that use the openings of the walls of it. You know, I never expected kids to take one of the noodles and put it through the openings and make slides out of it. So there was something really incredible about the way that was being used. So we really didn't expect, like even when we had our group of students there helping us construct it, you know, they started climbing 10 feet walls. And I'm like, what, you guys can climb this? This is insane. And then the first day of our installation on opening night, there were all these parents yelling at their kids being like, no, 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 don't play with it. Don't play with it. We're like, no, actually play with it, please. Like this is a part of the project. So we staged our students to pretend they were like in the audience and to start having them do specific motions so people could feel really comfortable in inhabiting the installation. And then it wasn't like an artwork to look at, but it was something to interact with. And with that in mind, we created this web app, which is still available. It's ragdalenoodles.co, where basically you could press a little squiggle, which will give you a different configurations for the noodles. There's a drawing option, so you could draw your own noodle on top. And then we also had images of the construction, which linked to like an Instagram hashtag, so you could see like how it was made. But the website, I think, is still up. Last I checked, it was still up. And going back to the idea of reenactments is that after we built this, we made this triptych because we wanted to almost do, like we consider our reenactments to be like a post-occupancy study, kind of. So we decided to kind of create these images that capture the energy that we were missing the first time around when we designed it. We wanted to think about all the potential and possibilities that we didn't really capture on the first try. The one thing I will say that's missing is that when we were painting the stage, there were constantly like deer paw prints because at night, the deer would have their own performances. So that's something that's definitely missing in these triptychs. In 2020, when COVID hit, we were trying to find a way to how to deal with the isolation that came with quarantine. So one of the things that we did was to create a drawing web app called ourpaper.space, which is still also up if you want to go to it. It's an interactive drawing app that anybody can log in. And from this, we were invited to do an installation at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago in spring of 2020. And we were trying to figure out, the fall of 2020. We were trying to figure out like, how do we create an installation where it's hybrid? So some people are going to interact with it in person, but most of the student population is going to be online. So we're going to create an exhibit that basically nobody's going to enjoy. So we're trying to figure out how do you navigate that. So for us, we decided there were three main elements to it. The app, which we connected to a webcam there. So whoever was logged into the app, though the webcam is no longer up, it's just a drawing app again. So they can kind of see, we added it so it wouldn't be super surveillance, like nobody's gonna be creepily watching it, but we created some abstraction filters on top of the webcam. So you could draw on top of the image, which will then be displayed on the screens. With the mesh screen, we cut up this blobs, which they were 6 feet apart to create social distancing seating. So you could be at psych, like on your way to class, drawing on your phone, and then your friend who's at home in the apartment could also be drawing. So that way it became both an interactive exhibit for both those who were at home and those who were at school. And this is a picture of the final installation where you kind of see somebody on their phone drawing on the app, the webcam itself, and then the mesh blobby curtain that fell before it, creating the seating. And in 2019, so I kind of jump around, by the way, in dates. This is not necessarily a chronological presentation, but it's kind of chronologically connected, thematically connected in some ways. In 2019, we submitted for the home competition, which is a competition that imagines that asks what is the future of the home. And for this project, we were considering what does it mean to be radically pragmatic. So for us, the 21st century has yet to fulfill its predecessor's promise of capsule, pod, and spaceship living. While calls for architecture to become high-tech or metabolic resulted in canonical experiments and striking images, cities never quite accepted the concept of space-age living. The imagined futures of the 60s and 70s became footnotes in the histories of various modernisms, rejected by a public more concerned with automobiles, mass media, and accruing capital. But even though plug-in cities and capsule skyscrapers didn't become mainstream, building components did evolve to become, according to Banham, an ensemble of domestic gadgetry that epitomizes the intestinal complexity of gracious living. The 4x4 house is an exploration of this domestic gadgetry and a radically pragmatic response to the call for new modes of domesticity. It does not propose novel forms, but instead repurposes existing technologies to produce new spatial conditions. Using one of the most common building component, the hydraulic elevator, the 4x4 house revisits the notion that a house could be a machine for living in. With 16 possible configurations and an externalized fluid insulation envelope, it reverses the typical arrangement of a house's intestinal systems to produce space that is modular, mutable, and accessible to all. As you can see in this section, each module moves up and down, creating new combinations of public versus private. When all the modules are down, the house has a strong presence on the street. When all the modules are up, it creates an alleyway for the public. And though this project proposes a future of housing, we didn't want to ignore the importance of showing domestic scenes. So even though it is within an elevator, there is a value to creating scenarios where we're talking about what does it mean to cook with your family in this house? What does it mean to step into the shower or to have a meal? And even also because they move up and down, we view this project as an argument towards like a sense of negotiation. Like you will have to negotiate with your family when the module goes up and down. You can't slam the door when you're mad at your parents. You have to ask them if you can move the module all the way up and ignore them. But it also creates these moments when they're halfway up, like in the top right, where you have this ambiguous sense of private versus public and create semi-private areas. And similar to noodle soup, we're also kind of interested in the labor and production that it would take to make whatever we're doing. So we tend to add construction diagrams. For this, since we imagine the future of the house, we imagine it'll be mass produced like an elevator, but just more robots because it's the future. But of course, there's always quality assurance. And as you can see here in the elevations, when the modules are down, the insulation system tends to billow on top and it becomes like a hug. And versus when the modules are all the way up, the insulation system acts like a gateway, an entry form to an alleyway. This allows for the project to constantly have a shifting relationship to the street. So this is a reenactment image of a science fiction collective performance that we did in 2017. So as part of the sideshow, the 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennial, we wanted to put in a science fiction collective performance. And although science fiction is usually associated with futuristic visions, the stories that stand out are typically those that are put forth as analogies to contemporary issues. Therefore, we can say that sci-fi can be used as a proxy to critique the matters of the present. Using this conceptual strategy, the project sought to respond to the topic of otherness by inviting an audience to participate in a collective science fiction performance. The performance and installation was composed of 2 inflatable, 1 see-through, one shiny. As visitors approached the inflatables, we stopped them and asked, "Are you an alien? Is anybody in your household an alien? Are you not from Earth?" And a lot of it, we kept trying to keep the questions ambiguous, and we got a series of answers. The first would be they'll treat it with silliness. They're like, "I'm not a little green figure. I don't have a UFO in my backyard. This isn't third rock from the sun. I'm not hiding out in plain sight." And others took it more seriously, saying, "I'm not from this country. I am an alien." And that was the purpose of this conversation. This is right after President Trump was inaugurated. So this is in 2017. I myself, I'm a first-generation American. My partner had recently become a citizen. So the nature of otherness was really present in our minds. And we wanted to talk about a critical issue such as immigration, but bringing it forward towards a science fiction lens to really ask this question, what does it mean to be other? And how can we showcase it in different ways? So we went the alien routes because we also don't take ourselves too seriously. So we 3D printed these manipulated cubes and put them in jars full of Jello. And then we had these light tables inside the inflatables to make it seem like they were aliens. And we made little nameplates and tags about what type of alien nature they were. It created this very eerie effect because we also created our own agency. So as you walked into the installation, we stopped and asked you questions with fake badges and flashlights, being really serious about the answers of otherness. So all of this came together to kind of create these images, these eerie images of science fiction within an installation. And here's a time lapse. Is it playing? No. So here's a time lapse of both the installation, but also the performance. You can see as an entertainer, students and flashlights stopping people. There was also a more practical reason why we had to do this. And it's that inflatables are only kept up with air pressure, so you couldn't have too many people stepping into an inflatable at the same time. So by delaying also them entering, it meant that they actually stayed inflated and wouldn't deflate. So we were also trying to time how many people would go in and out. This took place in the Chicago Athletic Association. Unfortunately, children were very terrified of this because they thought they were real aliens. So I think we're too believable. But I did think there were some really great conversations that emerged because it was me, it was 4 of us, Gallo, myself, and 2 students who were having these conversations with the audience members that came in. And I think, it ended up actually being great for conversations about these larger issues of otherness, especially during the political and cultural rhetoric that was going around. And this is our most recent exploration into soft materials. This project is called Lightweight Construction. And this project takes the imagery of construction and softens it to suggest new kind of intimacy between viewers and materials, as well as a recognition of labor. The animation in this project will be on display in the round on the flat exhibition at Pratt that opens tomorrow. But this version of Lightweight Construction was an interactive installation that was built at Woodbury University's Wedge Gallery this past fall. People were invited to touch and play with the softened construction materials. We had rugs with seamless brick pattern printed on them, as well as wood shingles. We had foam pillows that resembled 2x4 studs, and of course, sheer curtains with typical 4x8 sheet materials printed on them. The curtain wall panels created these uncanny effects that, like the animations, play with the particular expectations of materiality and imagery you don't expect to see through drywall or OSB. But the layering of these wall assemblies became a different kind of layering here, a visual type of layering. In a way, it's a bit of a semantics game, but we like to think of it we like to think of this project just like a lot of our other work, where we like people to do a double take and go, what? There's something not right in these projects. We really kind of enjoy, we say we always kind of go for the chuckle in our projects. Like we want something that there's an automatic kind of visceral reaction to it. And we're interested in whether it's a material behaving in a way that it's not supposed to, or an image that just looks a little bit off. We're really interested in having people question what they're looking at and talking about it. We also wanted to code the show in a way. All the materials are recognizable patterns. We know that's OSB from the pattern. We know that's a gypboard. We didn't want to make it too complicated to understand in that way, but we also wanted to call attention to labor in a way. So we use a bright safety orange where it's supposed to make somebody, especially road workers, the most visible, but they're also the most anonymous laborers that we have. We only recognize them through their orange vests, and we never notice them as an individual. So we wanted to kind of highlight the labor as more of a coded signifier with the orange. So their second material studies is called Building Without Water. So concrete, we all know concrete. But concrete is one of the most ubiquitous building materials in the world. And in 2012, concrete production accounted for approximately 1.7% of the global water use. And by the way, the global water use used for industry is 9%. So concrete's taking up the majority of the water issues for industrial uses. And more importantly, concrete produces significant greenhouse gases, which contribute to our ongoing climate catastrophe. Yet architects continue to design for concrete as if it was a limitless resource. Even when discussing new or emerging technologies such as 3D printing, which is a popular mode of fabrication, which we all are accustomed to, we still use 3D printing with concrete and call it novel. But now that 3D printing is becoming more and more common, like we can see how many 3D printers we have here, we need to start thinking about the waste that comes with it. Because PLA, though it's a bioplastic, it doesn't mean that it's biodegradable. unless it's within its powdered form. So these projects were, how do we deal with this waste that we're making in architecture schools and we're not ever talking about it, right? There's so much, there's a limitation to how many Christmas ornaments you can make from failed 3D prints and old projects. So we need to find new ways to reuse it. So this project takes form in two ways. The first is what we call plastic masonry. It's inspired from Gabion walls and ramped earth. And we were thinking about what happens if PLA, when melted down, can become like a cage. It can hold, just like a Gabion wall, it can hold loose material and still be structurally strong. So using a baking pan and a heat gun, we've been exploring how to break down 3D prints, especially failed prints. As you can tell here with all those filaments, that was not a successful print. And how can we reuse it in new ways? The second method we're calling petrified PLA, where we take powdered PLA and we mix it with sand. And then we take a tube and a wire and we run electricity through it. And then we bake it. And what happens when the heat is running through it, the plastic is binding with the sand and it's binding to the heat source, similar to like baking a cake. And when you're baking it, you actually create a solid and high compressive strength material that can follow more non-orthogonal forms. So you can see here on the left, there is like, you make a box, you have this mixture of sand and PLA powder. We basically, design the wire and then we make holes and put it in, that I don't have pictures of, and then you bake it for an hour, 2 hours. It's like a pound cake. And then when you take it off, it basically becomes almost like your Indiana Jones. You have to dig through it to find it. And once you do, you have kind of this hardened object, and this becomes the final piece. And we're still working in relatively small forms, like small scale, but you have a relatively solid and high compressive strength object that reuses PLA in different ways. And for our show at the University of Kentucky, we decided to kind of think about how do we use this project to rethink a building component. So we thought about doorknobs and how you really have doorknobs and door levers, and that's about it. We're not really reconsidering what does it mean to hold, to grasp, to twist, to turn. So we use this process to make this project, which is called Handle with Care, all about different ways of dealing with doors, different ways of holding and grabbing and pulling and pushing. So they're all like, your hand can fit in different ways. And then we painted it blue because there's always holes in it. We're still perfecting it to look really nice, but we needed to bind the sand. So we use paint as the best way to kind of bind the sand within the plastic. Because it's still kind of, I think you can either cover it with like super glue, but you need a coating to make sure everything stays so water doesn't get in. And then again, this is the reenactment of the process. So as I've been mentioning with our reenactment process, these drawings usually happen as more as a process of reflection on what we did. But as being a reenactment, we also take liberties with it. Like, we're not two twins. We don't have a golden retriever. Or unfortunately, I do not have a tablecloth that looks like terrazzo, though I want to. All right. And this is my last category, which is the most recent. I've been focusing on food for about like a year and a half now. I really have this interest in the relationship between food and architecture in two different scales. The first is the legacy of food colonialism within this hemisphere. It's food colonization, and the way that food has been used as a tool of both oppression and liberation is still really prevalent within our communities, and it's still felt today. You see it with the haciendas in Latin America, you see it with the Jeffersonian grid, you see it with the food that we eat. Most of the food that we eat was brought here by colonizers. They actually are not native to this area. My second interest deals with the nature of food imagery, the legacy of food images, and how both historical and contemporary food images describe space and the human perspective. The one thing to understand about food research and food colonization is you have to get into the mind of the colonizer. And in medieval Europe, it was all about humoral medicine, which meant that it was all about your biles. So on the top left is your phlegm, on your top right is your sanguine, on the bottom left is your black bile, and on your bottom right is your yellow bile, the choleric. To be healthy, you have to be perfectly balanced. Each of them correspond to their own elements as well as their own season. So sanguine, which is for blood, your elements are hot and wet, and your season was spring. If you are perfectly balanced or just had a little bit more sanguine in you, then you were patient and kind. If you had too much, then you were hot-tempered and mean. For the choleric, if it was hot and dry and summer, if you had too much yellow bile, then you were very easy to anger and nobody liked you. If you had too much black bile, then you were melancholic. You appeared pale and swallow, and you were most associated with autumn. And if you had more phlegm, then you tend to be very slow and sleepy, not really capable of doing much work. And your seasons were cold and wet and winter. An imbalance of this meant disease. So especially like if you watch old movies and you see them bloodletting with leeches, it's because they're trying to balance this out. It was their way of understanding how the human body worked. But because of these judgments on food and what was considered healthy, like wheat, pork, cow, like beef and all these things, when the colonists first came to this hemisphere, they were bringing these ideals with them. So when Columbus landed in Hispaniola in 1492, that was the first act of globalization, and what is considered to be the first true real act of globalization, with the amount of seeds, livestock, plants, and diseases that were brought. So he leaves his settlers in Hispaniola, he comes back a year later and everybody's dead. And he's like, what just happened? Nobody really knows how they died. Some of them assume that it was probably the Taínos rising up and defending. Some assume that it was the environment. They got some type of tropical disease and they died. Columbus was just, well, our European bodies were not meant to survive here, so we need to bring food. We need to bring olive oil. We need to bring wine. We need to bring bread. We have to make sure that our foods are here, because if we keep eating the native food, we're going to become native. So part of the humoral body, if you know the saying, you are what you eat, they took it very literally back in the day. So they thought that if they ate a lot of native foods, they would lose their beards and they would no longer become Spanish. So they thought they were actually going to transform into different people. So there was this, and especially when we're talking about the 15th century Spain, and they're kind of dealing with their Spanish identity and trying to form a Spanish identity, this becomes a huge deal. So this legacy is really kind of impactful today. Like the reason why we eat wheat, why it's considered healthy, you know, so many elements were brought here were because of that. Actually, the majority of our livestock that we eat today were brought with this because it was assumed to be healthy. And then when they brought these things in, they started to think about, well, we know how to grow these in Europe, so that's how we're going to grow it in the Caribbean. That's how we're going to grow it in North and South America. So then that legacy of specific agricultural practices in Europe really defined our entire urban landscape within this area. And this idea of food sovereignty becomes really critical, because food sovereignty has been an issue since the moment that Spanish arrived in this area. And with this in mind, we're really interested in this idea of food sovereignty. So when this competition popped up, we're like, oh, let's try to do something with food. So this is not tackled that much history of colonialism, but it's what we've been interested in. So in Columbus, Ohio, they were doing this affordable housing competition called Next Home. And it was, can you design an affordable house that can be replicated and adapted for $170,000, which if you've been practicing, that's like no money. And for us, we argue that new build projects in the city of Columbus must take into account the quality of life aspects that could contribute to building a prosperous community beyond the commodities of real estate and its economics. That is to say, how can the residential typology be reimagined to promote healthy and happy neighborhood life? And how can residents become empowered without relying on rental properties like accessory dwelling units or trying to run businesses within it? Like how do we focus specifically on life and enjoying that life? So for us, this began with food. The project centers around the acts of cooking and eating as core components of community building. It is geared towards multi-generational families, as well as growing families. In addition to providing essentials for comfortable living, our project prioritizes the spaces for cooking together, eating together, sharing knowledge about food, and providing access to food. This project elevates the role of the kitchen, indoor and outdoor dining, and the garden in daily life. Building on top, so it took place in the Hilltop neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, which used to be an agricultural neighborhood. So we wanted to bring that back. We wanted to bring back the idea of the garden as a productive garden. We wanted to get rid of lawns because we all know A, lawns are inefficient, and B, bad for the environment. And we wanted to create something that was focused on food as delight and part of community building. It was not supposed to be a complete farm, but instead a site for engaging landscape in intimate ways. Resident can farm a few herbs and or vegetables to complement a meal. This is not supposed to be like your only source of food, but a way to supplement and bring things together. And the goal is to produce things to eat, not to sell, though of course it's always an option. There are both indoor and outdoor eating areas. Inside the home, dining is integral to everyday life. The table is surrounded by life on all sides, facing an open kitchen, but for homework, but also, it's for homework, it's for projects, it's for trying to do a puzzle. The kitchen is more than just a place to eat. It's a place where your family gathers, where you have conversations. And we really wanted the dining room and the kitchen to extend further from the inside to be able to go outside. So each house actually has 2 outdoor dining areas as well as an indoor dining area. And with this competition being such a small budget, they asked us to come up with an adaptability plan. So we created 5 different options of different square footages and how this could happen. But we also proposed a landscape adaptability model where perhaps, if they had, the idea was they had like 15 vacant lots within one neighborhood. It's like, okay, what happens if we think about this strategically? What if let's say if somebody grows lettuce and somebody grows tomatoes, you have to walk 5 blocks and make a connection there. What if somebody has a community pizza oven? How are there ways where they can share and talk about food and not make it into an industry, right? Not make it all about survival, we'll make it about community building. And that was what we were really thinking about this project. We didn't get anything, we didn't win, but we had a really good idea of like thinking about this. And I luckily was working, so it's me, my partner, and our friends, Ryan Scott Pickey and Kristen Mims, who were it's a really great collaboration in general. And we're still thinking about food in different ways. And the second half, which is the last thing that I'll talk about, is my interest in food imagery. So I do have a very strong interest in visual representations and our visual life. So food, especially during quarantine, became a form of solace. Experience is a combined digital and social presence of bread making, documenting, and sharing. It dominated our everyday lives through social media images, Great British Bake Off marathons, and other forms of media. Food media, already a popular mode of consumption, became even more popular as a source of comfort. The photos of food that flooded our Instagram and other social media platforms became glimpses of the new lives we were living, or albeit the glimpses that we were willing to share. This project bases itself on classical Dutch and Flemish painting. So this is a 16th century, this is a 17th century painting called Still Life with Cheese by Floris van Dijk. As you can see, this is a pretty common still life at the time, where you see a table, you see a collection of fruits, vegetables, some type of beverage. It could be an allegory for some religious symbolism, or it could be about showing their wealth, right? They have enough money to commission artists to paint their wealth through food. So a way to kind of show their colonial powers in a way. But for me, I'm interested as a domestic act that gets ignored when you put these tables together. We don't see the space. We don't see the people that do the labor. We don't see anything else but the imagery of the food. And if we can look back to our social media images, these are not that different from each other. They both are very specific. The social media images tend to be top view or frontal view, similar with this, tends to be a frontal view. That's rarely a multi-perspective to it. And one of my favorite examples of how food imagery can even go further was, so these are images from the first illustrated cookbook, which came out in 1570 by Bartolomeo Scappi. He was the chef for the Pope and cardinals and all of these big wigs in Italy during the Renaissance. And so this is like 100 years after the perspective is invented. So there's also like these amazing, beautiful early perspective drawings that we're seeing. But it's also the first ever cookbook. He wrote down 1,000 recipes with accompanying images of how to make the best banquets. He shows the spaces of the kitchens. He shows the labor that it takes to make all of these components. He doesn't ignore it. Supposedly, the rumor is this is the first time a fork gets, I don't think it's this one, but this is the first time a fork ever gets drawn in a cookbook. And I don't know if I believe it. I feel like that feels like too far stretched with truth. But there is this activity that exists with these food images that I think we need to bring back. Because, there are certain elements that still continue today. So even when we look at Julia Child, she broke down so many barriers by writing down mastering the art of French cooking by making it accessible to to American audiences. But what became really critical about the image and media of Julia Child is that she invited you to the home. Where you saw her cook was her house. That's where it was filmed. Before this, the only cooking TV shows that existed were in basically the same TV stations where they did the nightly news. So it was very sterile. It was very much like a counter. It was like, this is how you make all these great like appetizers when you're having a dinner party. Julia Child came out and she's dropping dishes, she's breaking things. It becomes an affair and it becomes an event. Without knowing it, Julia Child really championed the open floor plan because everybody's like, I want to see people cooking. I want to be part of the spectacle and the event. And she led away with modernism in a way that we don't really talk about because it was all about the way that the camera framed Julia Child. It was the way that you saw her cooking as though she was home. And then everybody wanted that. Everybody's like, I want to be able to sit at my dining room table and have somebody entertain and be the cook and allow this to be a larger conversation of domesticity. And this is why I'm interested in food images, because I think there is such a large repercussions to both the way that they show culture, but also the way that it has changed architecture and public conceptions of architecture. So not necessarily for architects, but how as we as a culture accepted these images and change them. Because even today, when we see the Great British Bake Off, you can see the same color pastels being used. The nice little, the nice homey elements like the teapots in the background, the wooden countertops. These elements are specific, right? They're trying to make you feel like you're home. But granted, this home has like 10 stations and 10 very British people who freak out and start drinking tea all the time. So very different from our houses. But there's a level of comfort that's coming through these images, and we can all bring it back to Julia Child, but we can also bring it back to Bartolomeo Scappi and our obsession with food images so we can see in 16th century art. And that's my more current research. So I haven't developed any design propositions yet. TBD. And that's it. Thank you. Questions? I can put up the chat here if anybody. Yeah?
Oh, well, first of all, I thought it was extraordinarily well written.
Oh, thank you.
Clarity. The thing that struck me throughout was how nothing was static.
Yeah,
everything is moving for you.
yeah,
And it may be simply that's the time we all live in. Um, and everything always is moving, and that's what we have to adjust to. But I think
Yeah.
for so long, so much of architecture was about trying to find the ultimate static condition.
yeah.
And this is not that.
Yeah,
Are you conscious about those things?
yeah, we are. I think we're definitely conscious about it. I'm personally also conscious about it because I do think there's kind of this legacy. Yes. So, Richard, David asked if I'm conscious about the constant kind of moving elements and how it sticks throughout all my work. It is a conscious decision, I will say. I think a lot of it is just, I feel like we do live in a time of kind of instability. But I think it's because when I think about the nature of static architecture, and I think the nature of these elements that we consider to be monumental, as Cuban Chinese and first generation American, like I have no connection to something that looks like an ancient Greek structure. Like Palladio, sure, great. I like the geometrics, but for me, culturally relevancy with that is not connected. So it's also kind of a way to kind of fight the status quo and to think about, what happens if we accept these things as not static, right? Like what if our environment becomes unstable, but we embrace the instability. We embrace it as a way to make condition for change. So we do it in subtle ways, but I also think it's about the nature of intimacy and interaction. I feel for a lot of the time, we think about the greatness of architecture, but not our own individual interaction and engagement with the built environment. And for me, I like as a designer, I remember when I was practicing, my favorite elements would be when I would work on a building and then I would see like the office administrator put the copier in front of this fancy curtain wall. And I thought it was amazing. I was like, yeah, like manipulate it, take it over. Like I want to see the copier from the street. I think that's great. I think it's like everybody, like every other architect's nightmare that ruins the perfect image of it. But there was something about the sense of ownership of your own space. And I realized that only happens when you can move stuff. When you can add curtains, when you can start to paint your own walls, when you can shift anything, like that's the only time you feel like you own your environment. And I think we're critical about that. That like for somebody to feel comfortable, they need to own it. And I think there's something also nice about, I think personally too, there's something also nice to give up certain powers, right? As a designer, where you're like, well, some things are out of my control and that's okay. And so I don't have to make everything perfect. So I feel like it also liberates us a little bit more because we don't have to fully control it. Yeah, I'll do my best to repeat it. Yeah. Thank you.
So, I started about how as our society evolves and changes with technology and artificial intelligence, and I just started wondering, do you and your team kind of incorporate technology or even AI into your projects and into your kind of creative process? And how do you think architecture can change? Or do you guys kind of block that and just want to create things that are more tactile and real and physical and not necessarily a screen?
So the question was, do we kind of ignore the digital and just emphasize kind of the tactility of things, or is there kind of a balance? So I would say for us, we're incredibly digital actually. So like when we did Noodle Soup, we did a lot of physics simulations to see how it would work. But one thing we discovered is that not a lot of people model soft things. So it's actually really hard to try to simulate these elements. So we had to learn how to use the digital in our favor. So for me is that I'm not necessarily fighting against the digital. I'm using soft materials as an argument that the digital and soft materials need to work together. Because one of my biggest pet peeves when I was a designer were multi-purpose rooms. There were giant rectangles with projectors and just steel case furniture that moved. And everybody's like, look at the perfect the perfect room of the future. And I'm like, it's just a rectangle with steel case furniture and wheels. Like, how is this the room of the future? So I think for me, it's about acknowledging that the digital is going to be here. We have to critically question it because, for example, the issues with AI are also like I think Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology does an incredible job at explaining kind of the biases that exist within our technological world. And we can't ignore these elements because why? Like, because they're not neutral and they're not unbiased. So we have to be very careful in how we use certain technologies. But I think for us, we're just like, well, technology it's a method and a tool, not a limitation. Because I think if we view it as a limitation, then it becomes us versus them. And I think as architects, we need to move away from just accepting the status quo of certain software and learn how to manipulate that software to even necessarily code it. So at Virginia Tech at University of Houston, my partner and I ran some coding courses for P5JS. We're like, what happens if you make your own drawing tools? What if you have control over these things? Because I do think there is a certain level of ownership that needs to exist. So for me, like the idea of soft materials, it's a really good question, by the way. Like I think it's like, I don't think we think about it constantly, but for me, it's a way where they need to interact together because I'm fighting against the sterile white rectangle rooms that get called multi-purpose rooms with giant projectors and screens. And they're like, this is the room of the future. It's like, no, it's not. Like we need to consider the role of the architect and the role of materiality in these spaces. And they don't have to fight each other. And they don't have to be they don't have to be opposing each other. And we also don't have to be bending backwards for technology, but it's a conversation and how you use it. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay. Yeah.
You ever think about bringing
So this question was like, do we ever think about bringing the outside in with a homegrown project? Yes and no. So I think when it comes to that, the issue is that you'll need a way more bigger budget. So our budget was 170,000. I did the cost estimation, which was already kind of questionable, to be frank, because like it's 170,000 is like no money for that big of a lot, and all the lots were the same size. So to do that, we would probably have to create like a more robust system that can handle it, because Columbus is the Midwest, so it has terrible weather for a decent amount of the year. So to bring the outside in would have taken a lot of systems to overcome it, and we just never had the budget for it. I think conceptually, if we weren't thinking about budget, that would have been kind of like, how do you start to grow things on the inside, or how do you kind of seamlessly blend in? But at 170K, there's not much you can do. And we were also considering how you could easily replicate it. Because it was the competition itself was like, how can you create an adaptability model that could be moved around to any part of Columbus? So also like having things go outside in is so site specific that it would maybe be really difficult for that competition itself to make an adaptability model that wasn't allowed to be site specific. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's like it was a tricky one because they're like, oh, here are 20 potential sites. Pick one as an example. So we just chose one at Hilltop from the given example. So yeah, I think outside in works really well when it's better climate and better budget and very specific sites. So you actually know what you're bringing in, and you're not just throwing an idea out there. Great. Any other questions, virtually or in person? Craig?
Wasn't really a question, I was trying to make an observation. It seems interesting that it shows the material studies first of making that new brick.
Yeah.
And the way you described it seems to be influenced by some of your food studies. So I find the cross-pollination within your own research fascinating. I don't know if you're aware of it, maybe you are.
Yeah, I'm kind of aware, but I also think that I've always just been like a baker in my life. Like I've taken a pastry class. I just like to cook and bake. So a lot of my terminology or things that I reference to are always going to be food analogies. Yeah, because like I never know the best way to call it. So I'm like, it's basically like you make an oven. It's like a cake. You're just baking a cake. So yeah, it's hard for me to come up with other like non-food terminologies to explain it.
But it's always, it's a logical extension, I think, of,
Yeah.
of like how you might think about materials. That way, you put the two things together, and you have processes of hardening, and yet there's a real interesting parallel. Can I change my question?
Well, you can just ask a second question.
Because of this conversation about the other question, so instead of talking about sort of movement,
Mhm.
I actually think this is more about speed.
Speed.
Okay?
Yeah.
And now that you're talking about cooking, it is, the timing becomes critical, is understanding what it is to make these things happen. So my question to you is, when is the time to go slow as opposed to go fast?
For those virtually, David amended his question to make it a question about speed and when is the time to go slow versus fast. I don't know, because I feel like I don't know if any of my projects move fast because I never really envisioned the elevator going super fast because you could actually injure somebody.
Could we make the case that the digital world is all about speed, that it is about doing everything faster? That is at the core of
Yeah.
all this technology.
Yeah.
Speed is the ultimate refiner. And the faster we can go, the more valuable we think the technology is.
Yeah, speed is part of the digital. Yeah.
So where is the place to go slow anymore?
Well, I think I think for me, it's not necessarily about going slow. It's that I think there's a misconception that the digital is fast. Like I remember when I worked at a firm, my boss is like, 3D print this. It'll be done in 5 minutes, right? I'm like, nah, that's not how it works. Or like, oh, you can make this rendering super fast. You just press Enscape and it's a go. And it's like, no. Like, I think that we have an assumption that the digital is automatically fast because we're thinking about it in levels of efficiencies and productions and not as an actual act of labor and making. So we think about it more in like the factory settings and not as in like humans working on it. Because I think once we think about the digital as something that is with people involved, then it's not fast. Like I think we spent like maybe 2 weeks just making like in simulations of like of these things. We started to like do like little like, we don't have any pictures of it, but we made like stop animations with clay because we're just like, we can't really, rendering wise, we don't know how to do this. So we're going to try to figure out different ways. I think once you add the human component to the digital, you realize that it's actually very slow. Like I think a lot of stuff we do seems fast, but it takes a very long time to figure out. And I think once you add the human component and remove this idea of like, basically what late stage capitalism efficiencies that come with the digital from it. I think once you bring like labor and people in it, it slows down so much. Because like, I remember like my professors in architecture would be like, a drawing would take me a week. And I'm like, my sectionist still took me a week. Like I was just doing different things to it. Like just because I did it in Illustrator instead of like drawing it by each line, didn't mean that I spent any less time on it. I just did other stuff to it. So it still took me the same length that it took you to draft it. It just became a different type of drawing. But I think it's interesting. I never thought about it as speed. I like thinking about it as speed. Because then it feels like very much connected to like the learning from Las Vegas, an idea of the car and speed.
This is something we talked about before. The distinction between quantity and quality.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's really a core, right? That's like, yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting point. Speed. I gotta think about my priors and speed. I have it. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you so much. Natalie.
Thank you.
We'll be back here in 2 weeks.
Thank you, virtual folks, for joining.